Hello, everyone. Welcome back to a new episode of Juicy Conversations. If you like this episode and the podcast, don't forget to give it a rating and a review, to follow Juicy Conversations on all streaming and social media platforms. And as always, the DMs are open if you have any questions, ideas, or if you simply want to take the conversation further. In the meantime, it's time for me to welcome my guests. Welcome, guys. Welcome to this episode. Before anything, we're just going to go around the Zoom quickly. If you all want to introduce yourselves, and then we'll move on to the topics of today.
Hi everyone, my name's KJ or Karim, and I am a final year student and I'm a queer activist, and I'm very excited to have some discussion about this topic.
Hey, I'm Pete. Yes, I'm still technically at uni and just pretty gay, so yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Nadia. My pronouns are she, her, and I identify as pansexual.
Perfect. And as always, I am Julie. I will be the host of this conversation. So today, as you would have heard in the introduction, we're going to be talking about the HIV/AIDS epidemic that broke out in the 80s. We're going to be going through the stigma that was caused around it. We're going to go through the framing and the narrative around the issue. And we're going to look at how it's impacted all victims and survivors, but especially the LGBTQ community, as there has been a lot of homophobia that arose from this and that continues to this day. So for anyone that isn't sure what HIV and AIDS are, they are two separate things. So HIV is an infection that is sexually transmitted that will attack your immune system. And then AIDS is the syndrome that will emerge from HIV, which can lead to a certain numbers of illnesses and infections that your body is not able to fight as well due to your immune system having been compromised. While we're at it, we'll break down some of the misconceptions around AIDS and HIV as well. So it is, as I said, sexually transmitted, and it is something that develops through your blood. So you cannot catch HIV or AIDS through touch, through saliva, through sharing a bathroom, through sharing towels, through kissing. It is very rare that you can develop it through oral sex, but you can, in rare cases, develop it through sharing needles. And pregnant women can also transmit it to their babies during pregnancy, during birth, or when breastfeeding. Also, I will be putting a lot of resources and links all over the social medias, all over the streaming platform. You can go to those links if you want to find out more about the illness, about what causes it, about the symptoms and the treatments, because HIV today is something that we cannot cure, but that we can treat to make sure that most people, or vast majority of people that do contract the illness, are able to live with it and live a long and healthy life. And if I can give you any tips before we get into the episode, is please wear protection when you're having sexual intercourse and get tested regularly, because there's no shame around it. And if it is something that you do end up contracting, the earlier you know about it, the better treatment you can get for it. So that's all I have to say. And now focusing on the epidemic itself, for anyone again that doesn't know, because it's something that isn't taught in mainstream history. This was an epidemic that broke out in the 80s, so in 1981, and it started in the United States. It was something that the medical world became aware of because 5 gay men started showing symptoms of a very rare lung infection and other infections, and they died very shortly after it from that. So it is something that initiated from gay men, but very early on we started realizing that it was something that a lot of women were testing positive to, and then a lot of heterosexual men as well. And within the first 6 months, so it was discovered in June, July of 1981. Within the first 6 months, we saw 108 people that had contracted the disease and 40% of them that had died by the end of that year. So with any new illness, we've seen it with COVID, a lot of panic is going to take place. People are going to start believing everything and anything. But the issue here is that the fact that it is something that was found within the gay community before anything else is that it added the stigma, homophobia, and hate, which led to even more stigmatization of the community and just even more chaos and madness, mainly in the US and then all around the world. So we'll start with talking about that. How would you say, because we're all in our 20s today, we obviously weren't alive for the epidemic, how would you say the stigma reflects today? And how much do you think that the fact that it is something that initiated within gay relations impacted the amount of stigma around HIV and AIDS today?
Brilliant question. Just to start off with, I think that the relation to, or the fact that it started out within the gay community has totally defined what this disease is, regardless of, who can catch it, which is everyone. It's something that started out, in the gay community, was very much rife within the gay community for several reasons that is not necessarily indicative of the gay people being at fault or queer people being at fault. So, back then there was very little protection. There was very little sexual education in terms of, homosexuality. And that is why what I believe is one of the reasons why it became so rife. And we do still have the stigmas today. I mean, even on TikTok, there are so many creators that have gone on that platform just to educate, the people of today about this disease, because I didn't even know about it. Like, it's until sort of I was 17, 18, because it was always something that happened ages ago, and it was always something that almost felt like it was part of history and it had already happened, and it was like very taboo to speak about. Like, you'd never speak about that. I would feel so uncomfortable. So that stigma, even nowadays, is very much present, and it's only really been in recent years that we're getting these TikTokers. Just to name one, Marlon Vandermark, and he is a 23-year-old, I believe, and he's going on TikTok just to spread awareness. And there's just this quote that I want to bring into it. So, I will always see older people talk about their lives with HIV, but I think the younger generation needs something to relate to as well. So it's about making the implications and the history of HIV accessible to the younger people, because we have to obviously move forward and continue the progress. But yes, the stigma is very much present.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you touched upon, it's not something that we learn about by default. It's something which you either learn through obscure pop culture references, like the Bohemian Rhapsody film, obviously with Freddie Mercury, kind of central figure of what we associate with the AIDS epidemic, even if that film had some interesting interpretations of events. But yeah, how it affects the queer community today, it's just so integral and central, because it's like this hidden part of history, this inside knowledge, which for most people doesn't have to be thought about. Sure, there's like conversations about sexual health. I mean, we talked about it on a previous episode of this podcast about kind of safe sex practices and everything like that. But I just feel like AIDS isn't the fear for most straight people. And thankfully, like, medicine has advanced to the point where with like PrEP, it doesn't have to be such fear anymore. But this was devastating, and it killed off almost an entire generation of queer people. We lost so much, and I think, yeah, there's a lot of people, like younger people, who won't know about this and might not care. But I feel like once your eyes are open to it, you can't not view the entirety of LGBT plus life through the lens of the AIDS epidemic, because it was just so dreadful.
Yeah, and also, as Pete is saying, like, we're viewing LGBTQ plus community mainly through the HIV AIDS epidemic that happened in the 80s. As someone who's coming from an Eastern European country, coming out even in the 21st century is still quite stigmatized because of the HIV AIDS epidemic. I don't think that countries from this part of Europe was that much impacted. However, I think because of the general media narrative and the news that were coming in from the UK, the USA, and other countries, I think it left quite a bit of a footprint, to say. And I think there is still a lot of stigma around here that it's basically something that is limited to the LGBT community. It is something that signifies, if someone has it, it means that, oh, they're part of the LGBT community, or to quote, they have sinned in some way. So yeah, I think that this kind of narrative brought about the stigma.
What Nadia said also reminded me of like how obviously I think it was 51% of people getting HIV or AIDS during the epidemic were queer, but obviously people who had blood transfusions, drug users, and I believe Haitians as well were particularly vulnerable to this. But even though almost the majority, well, just under half of the people getting it were not LGBT necessarily, it was still codified as the gay plague. And kind of what I hadn't thought about until just now it clicked is a lot of the homophobic abuse and slurs that we see in popular culture, especially from like the far right and the emergence of that, is still rooted in how the AIDS epidemic treated, kind of degeneracy, kind of impurities, dirty, diseased. Yeah, it kind of, even if it's not conscious, it all takes from that root.
No, definitely. I think just to pop back on the framing, I think in a way, and this may sound a bit insensitive, but society at that point in time and still today almost needed that to happen to kind of prove their point, because we're in the 80s. Sex is not something that's talked about. Sexual liberation is only happening because of the queer community, because they're the first ones that are openly talking about it and showing sexuality as something that is not to be demonized, and it's just something that's worth celebrating and worth sharing, and that's just what it is. And in the 80s, there were a lot of people, whatever their motive, that were not on board with that. And then this happened, and it kind of gave legitimacy to all those people that had been fighting against the big bad gay for ages now, who were trying to say that no, don't have sex. And they were trying to spread this narrative that the queer community, by trying to destigmatize sex, were evil. And then when this happened, we saw so many arguments of like, well, exactly, they're paying for their sins. This is what happens when you are foolish about your sexuality. They're doing this. Look what's happened to them. And it kind of reinforced not only the idea of you shouldn't be having sex, it's not for you. It also completely demonized the queer community. And I think that kind of links to why it even happened in the first place, because it's not because of anyone that this happened. It doesn't highlight the fact that we shouldn't be having sex, or that every gay man in the 80s was a child of Satan. It highlights the fact that people didn't know how to be having safe sex, and especially gay men had no idea how to have safe sex because they didn't feel that they could talk about their sexuality, and there were no platforms, there were no charities, there was no government, there was no representation or education on the matter. So I think the stigma fed into how poorly the epidemic was handled, and it continues to show throughout, because a lot of people will look at the epidemic now and still today and still place fault on the queer community and still use it as an argument to try and oppress people in their sexuality. But I think it's a cause-consequence effect. The stigma was already there because people just weren't ready for those conversations yet.
I mean, are you really surprised that people don't know how to identify an epidemic or a pandemic? I mean, what is this, year 2, nearly 3 of the current pandemic, and people will still blame it on kind of Chinese dietary culture or something in the wet markets there. It's just like, really?
Yeah. It's just people need a scapegoat. People need a scapegoat, and I think that's what it was in the 80s. People needed someone to blame because fear. And I can understand that you will be in fear. We've been through it. It's terrifying when this new kind of disease just comes out of nowhere and is killing people. But what could have been a great opportunity for sex ed and progress and improvement just turned into literally the trial of the queer community. And then I think, so when it comes to framing, we have to look at the media as well. So the media had, I think there were 3 main actors, one being just society in general, but another major player was the media, whether that's pop culture or the actual press. How do you guys feel that the media failed the queer community and society as a whole in trying to spread information and also maybe tame the situation a little bit?
It almost felt like the media was trying to sort of weaponize, I guess, the LGBTQ society, or maybe not weaponize, but beat a dead horse when it's down, beat somebody when they're down. You have this vulnerable group that is obviously not, it's not entirely LGBTQ people, but it's being framed in a way that it's like the gay plague or the gay disease. And then you have the media, which is trying to sort of put oil into the fires, trying to make it bigger and, to get people talking, to get people spreading rumors. And it just sort of became this huge thing where people did not know what the disease was. people did not know what the disease truly was. They knew it from a religious point of view, or they knew it from a cultural point of view, from what their parents was telling them, or from what their friends were telling them. But I think all this misinformation, the media is partly to blame, and it's also weaponizing and demonizing sex as well. And I think it came at a very, like you mentioned, it came at quite a crucial time, because you have the sexual liberation movement that was just about coming into play. But then all the sort of conservative elements of society sort of banded together and used this as a way of saying, look what happens when you have sex. Look what happens when you become sexually liberated. This is what happens. And then, this is bad. And that's how I feel like the media, for the most part, portrayed HIV. But then you also did have quite a lot of, icons that tried to fight the stigma, sort of Princess Diana, sort of Madonna, quite a lot of individuals that did obviously, use the media and use their public platforms as a means of doing well, I guess, for the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, kind of when we talk about how the media was responsible for this, I think the media and the government, for the most part, worked hand in hand in that they had a lot of interests aligned. They wanted to perpetuate this idea of the gay plague, and there were always going to be some standouts. Like, I know in America, there was this journalist who asked the Reagan administration at the media briefing or whatever, it's like, oh, what do you think of, or what's the president's response to the outbreak of AIDS cases? Or something. It's like, I don't know, I don't have it. Do you have AIDS? And laughing, it's like, oh, and there's 300,000 case concerns. It's like, ha ha ha, those silly gay people just dying. It's, yeah, the media completely fueled it. They loved it. They'd go to hospitals. They'd try work out if famous people were in there with AIDS. They'd kind of had elaborate schemes. They go, oh, these flowers are for John Smith or whatever. And they go, oh, thanks. Oh, so John Smith is here, you're saying? And they try sneak in. Like, horrible people. It was disgusting. And yeah, I mean, look at the media state. You think they were any better in the 80s? You think the people that work in the Daily Mail were going to be anything but 100 times worse than the 80s of all times?
Yeah, and also to just kind of jump in on Pete's point, it's we see that, especially in the 80s, the media silenced the voices that were trying to tell the actual story. And I think the problem with the HIV AIDS epidemic was that they didn't give the full story. So it was about more than just the queer community. It was about people living in poor conditions, people reverting to different kinds of drugs and using, as you said, Julie, needles, sharing needles, and then transmitting the virus. I think it's just the media didn't give the full story. They just focused on one group, when if they had given voice to all of the groups, maybe the pandemic would have been handled differently. But then again, when it comes to dealing with the epidemic in America, at least, I think that it all depended on the religious beliefs. And I think it also depended on the fact that the infrastructure for universal healthcare was not there. So I think that the system itself brought this upon those poor people that we lost from the disease, because they didn't provide the necessary care and treatment to actually understand the virus and actually treat it properly. So yeah, I think the media failed in the sense that they silenced almost half the population, and they gave voices to only the privileged ones, the ones that aligned with their ideas, their religious beliefs. And I think they really, really failed everyone that lost their lives. I remember reading some article that says in the 80s that demanded like the mask regimes, and all of the privileged people masked up to protect themselves from AIDS. But it's funny how these same people now are refusing to wear masks, and it's just mind-blowing, honestly.
Yeah, but I feel like that's even giving too much credit to society, ignoring kind of the ableist aspects of the AIDS epidemic. At the end of the day, people with illnesses and disabilities are not believed, full stop. And obviously, it's kind of was made 10 times worse by being associated with LGBTQ plus people. But yeah, like this was as much about about queerness as it was about just disability generally, and people still don't care about disability. It's like Nadia said, America, with the lack of universal healthcare, was not structurally able to handle this. The UK didn't handle this even with the NHS, and ultimately, yeah, I guess you could say the media failed, but equally the media, they weren't going to stop this in the first place. I think they proceeded exactly as they were doing, and they always will doing, and were a success unto themselves, because they are not concerned about queer liberation, queer joy, queer justice, disability. They don't care, and they don't have to care.
It's unsurprising, as you're saying, Pete, it's unsurprising to see how they handled it, because not only, yeah, the media can today be really good and be politically correct, and this is literally coming from someone who's been kind of dabbing in the industry and has a podcast. There can be like reliable sources, of course, but the media industry exists because of that shock factor. It's not about sharing facts always, it's about the title that's going to make the most amount of people go, oh, no way. And we're back in the 80s where political correctness is not even being discussed. People are easily using the F word, using the N word, like so wildly racist and homophobic and sexist. And it's just a big fat joke. We're literally in a men's locker room. Like, it's just disgusting at that time. And the media is just catered for these white, cis, straight men. Like, it's just catered for them. But the big mistake that they made there was to kind of underestimate how bad it could be. And we talked about celebrities. Some of our queer idols test positive and died from it, Freddie Mercury being one of them. We also had Eazy-E from NWA, which is literally one of like the gangster rap icons. Even though he's very problematic, he does say one of like the legends when it comes to rap and when it comes to gangster rap in the US. He was also HIV positive, and that's when people used him and were like, guys, this is not something that just targets one group. And still then the media was just making fun of it and not giving people any credit and not prioritizing science over rumors and gossip, which is where they massively contributed to the failure that the handling of this epidemic was. And then the last layer is that the media, I fully believe, is responsible for increasing homophobia, whether that be just in the thoughts, whether that be verbal abuse, whether that be physical abuse, whether that be sexual abuse. Because when you're, as a media, whether you believe that it is or not, you should never be calling this the gay plague, gay cancer, stuff like that. They contributed to the homophobic narrative that a lot of scientists were begging them to stop spreading, because the scientists were thinking of two things. They were thinking this is going to have such detrimental impacts on the community, but also you're not going to help solve the problem by doing this. And yeah, you're again interfering with the sexual education that clearly people needed by further stigmatizing it. And then all that people are going to take it as is a dirty little disease that is reserved for gay men, and learning absolutely nothing. And I don't know why we call it an epidemic, by the way. Can we call it a pandemic? It took us 2 months to start calling COVID a pandemic. So pandemic, I'm not saying epidemic anymore. But yeah, they contributed to it being way worse than it could have been. But they also highly contributed to homophobia going to the next level by allowing people who had these thoughts to continue having these thoughts.
Julie, what you were saying about the shock factor. Also, I think that with AIDS and also with COVID, I think the whole kind of media outlets, everyone, I think that a lot of fact checking is just being skipped purely because everyone's in a hurry to get it out there. And I think the media fails in the sense of not checking fully with scientists and also not checking kind of their political correctness, even though the idea of it was not widespread back in the 80s.
I mean, the media acting as kind of the commentariat. They're just they're an amplifier for what's there. And you had people like David Blunkett, a Labour former minister and coming back into the limelight of politics, when the Freddie Mercury documentary came out, not the film, he was in it saying, oh, well, you know, he lived a terrible lifestyle and reprehensible, morally wrong. And you got people like that coming back to the forefront of the Labour Party. Kind of Keir Starmer's just hired him to do some committee or other, who really knows or cares these days. But you had Ronald Reagan taking power in America, you had Margaret Thatcher taking power in the UK, the New Right. These people are horrible people, and the media are kind of their chums, really. So yeah, it's just, and you even had it in the last week or so, Tony Blair in The Independent saying that Keir Starmer must reject wokeism, and it's all talking about kind of trans rights and everything, because it's just the same battleground over and over and over again, and saying that Labour made a mistake in '83 by siding with the LGBT plus community in the middle of the AIDS epidemic. Oh, really, Tony? Was that a mistake, was it? And yeah, we're just seeing the same debates going on, but the target's changing. I'm just sick of it. It winds me up, because all this is rooted in is society hates gay people, society hates disabled people, society hates anybody which is different, and will do everything they can to crush them. And we're still seeing it today. It's just today it's slightly less PC to go for the gay community, so instead they go for the trans community. Try separate them, or try target them as kind of the idea of degeneracy and disease and threats and everything. It's just the exact same thing. I don't think we've really learned anything society-wise. Sure, we've had some good measures come in, like the implementation of free condoms. That was a direct result of the AIDS pandemic in the UK. But are we really that better off?
Period. Like, what is there to say other than that?
Definitely. And you've touched on it perfectly, Pete. You always do this. You always segue into my next points. But because if we're talking about people to blame, we're going to talk about the real people that are to blame, which is not gay men, which is not the queer community as a whole, but which is, as we've said, just widespread homophobia and lack of sex education, the media, and finally, our favorite, the governments. So another factor that definitely meant that this pandemic was way worse than it could have been was governments, whether it was the US government, because this is something that's originated in the US, but also European governments, because the UK, we see you, France not doing anything to support sub-Saharan countries when you've colonized half of them, we see you too. So what do we think government intervention, if there was any, what could have been done differently? Let's even talk about what actually happened, because a lot of people don't even know how poorly the governments managed it, and then we'll look at why that is, but we've already touched on it. And I will also add, it's a disease that was also impacting a lot of people in sub-Saharan Africa, but again, who cares about Black people, especially if they're not on our territory?
Yeah, I think what is just your point, Julie. I think it's all connected. I think it's just the media gave those politicians a platform. It all started with the government. They were incompetent. They didn't try to understand. They didn't fact check with the scientists. Things that it all feeds in. The government failed. They were the ones who were supposed to represent everyone, not just this portion of the society. They are there to represent and to support each and every member of the society. Whether that person can vote or is under the voting age, it doesn't matter. Even with the UK and the NHS, America without universal health care, and other countries in between and having their own systems, it was still up to the government to act up and make sure that they're not seeing so many deaths in their population. It's not about how you identify. It's not about your social status. It's not about your economic status. It's not about your education. It's about the fact that everyone needs healthcare and everyone should be provided with full healthcare.
Yeah, the government. Wow. So this is, of course, as I said, Margaret Thatcher, who introduced Section 28 a few years after the AIDS epidemic was well underway. What was it? 88 or something, and talked about how children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay, all of those children are being cheated of a sound start in life. Yes, because you are taking that sound start in life away from them. This person, let's face it, was evil, and she may be dead, but her legacy lives on in modern day politics, and it's an atrocity. She was an out and out homophobe. She hated gay people. She wanted them to die. They died. And it somehow, when you rely on kind of socially conservative institutions like the civil service and even the Conservative cabinet to be the better people, you know you're in a dark situation. And it was. The cabinet ended up bypassing Thatcher to release a bunch of educational materials to every house in the country in the UK, talking about kind of safe sex practices. And she tried to veto that because she was uncomfortable with the idea that if people are told about these sexual practices that they need to avoid, and then they'll be tempted to try it, because it's this whole idea, like Section 28, if they know about gay people, then, oh, God forbid, they might want to be them. And it's just ridiculous. But of course, obviously, that was a situation of it. Like I mentioned, you got old Blunkett still in the news, but he was kind of big homophobe back then. Of course, it was the government's fault. It was entirely their fault. And Reagan didn't say the word AIDS until 5 years into his presidency or something. And him and his wife turned their back on a friend who caught AIDS and left him to die. Let's face it, if you're a politician in the 80s, if you're Corbyn, you probably get a pass because he was actually talking about the right issues. The rest of them, I have stronger words than are allowed on this podcast for all of them.
I think, yeah, it's definitely, I mean, they are at fault. You can't leave that many people to die. Definitely they massively failed them. As you said, Reagan, I think it was 4 years after the outbreak, so yeah, maybe 5 years into his presidency, that he even dared to say the word. And you mentioned it as well. There were so many press conferences that were happening. I can't remember his name, but the clips are on YouTube. Like it's one of the biggest pieces of evidence of how homophobic the government was. But there were these press conferences with one of the members of Reagan's communication team. They were outright laughing every time a journalist tried to mention this issue year after year after year. They would make jokes, outright say they weren't really interested. And it kind of makes you sick to your stomach hearing about it, because you can clearly feel that they do not care, yet numbers are doubling. You literally go from about 800, I think, at the end of 1982 to about 1,200, something like that, by the end of the next year, and then to 2,400 by the end of that year. And it's just like, what more do you guys need? People were dying and nobody cared. And it is also the government's fault, because that is also something that you can find, is even though research and development was advancing, and as we've said before, now there isn't a cure, but there is a lot of medical interventions that can happen. There are a lot of medication that is available for people to still be able to live with HIV. But even though they were trying to make that happen, they were really struggling, because if governments didn't care, of course, like, it's diabolical of them to be so outright homophobic. But if we talk even more tangibly, they're not going to fund the people that need the funding. So you had activist groups that were trying to raise awareness and had to do the education on what AIDS and HIV was, because governments were not coming out with campaigns about it. You had researchers and doctors begging for funding, because they could, without funding, we're not going to get anywhere. And again, it's being super hypocritical, because again, we've seen it with COVID. The minute that it started getting out of hand, all the funding was going, as it should, of course, because people were dying. But all of the funding went towards research and development and trying to find a vaccine. And within a year, we had one. And then, yes, in countries like the UK, on top of that, you get governments that are insensitive, and they're actually putting in place laws and bills that are outright homophobic, that are going to alienate queer people from their countries even more, and from the rest of society even more. So being homophobic is one thing. And already, if you are, that's it. The conversation is over. But us, as a governmental body that is supposed to remain unbiased when it comes to people's healths and people's lives, it is unacceptable that governments were so openly careless about it and just went on about their lives as if actually nothing was happening. And when they started to recognize it was when cures were starting to be found, because then, of course, then let's give attention, because it's another way for us to sell our country. Oh, look, we found this amazing pill and we found this drug and now you can cure this. And all of a sudden it's in all of their mouths. But when people were dying and there were literally strikes in the streets every single day of people crying for their lives, radio silence for all of them. So I think, yeah, if there's one major actor to blame, it would be governments. And I see it a lot on social media. People, because a lot of activist pages, of course, talk about this. And a lot of people will be like, well, why is it the government's job? What have they done wrong? What more could they have done? I think all of what we said, and if you guys have anything to add, just summarizes that it is really fundamentally their job.
I think you touched up what you said about the fact that the governments were just blatantly not giving anything, and I think it speaks or indicates to a problem. Not only was this disease a cultural problem in terms of sexuality, but it was also a class problem as well, because a lot of the people that were getting affected by AIDS, it wasn't just because they were gay. I mean, in New York, you had obviously transgender individuals, gay individuals who had been kicked out from their houses, who had no form of income, who were destitute, who were poor, people who did not have access to healthcare because it was, not universal. It was not, it was very, very American. So it's a class issue. And then in the UK, I think it just wasn't affecting the rich politicians. Like, it's as simple as that. It just wasn't affecting them. If it was, it would have been addressed. It would have been sorted. Exhibit A, COVID. It touched everyone. It absolutely affected every single person, which is why there was a vaccine in 1 year and not in 10 years. Do you get me? Like, there was no matter of urgency because it just wasn't affecting the rich people. It wasn't affecting the people at the top. Whereas now, COVID is. So that's, I think, just sums up why the governments were just so, ignorant about it and so unsupportive. And then obviously you have that issue of sexuality. But I think at its core, it just wasn't affecting the people that it needed to affect in order to get urgent action.
Just super, super quickly, giving people their dues. Like, there was some funding. They eventually started paying attention to it. And research and development at that time, for a lot of them, were on top of it. A lot of them weren't, but some people did take it seriously. And also, like, we are making a lot of parallels with COVID. We do appreciate that the 80s, 2020, we're not at the same level. We've got more money. We've got more knowledge today. We've got more people. So that is also something that is worth considering. And that's not something that we're going to put to the side. But as you said, KJ, it does come down to the matter of urgency. That's the real issue.
And also, as Julie and KJ, you both said, especially in New York, as far as I know, in almost all major US cities, there are the so-called tent cities. So the places that have cheap rent, but most of the residents can't afford it anyhow. And they have low or no income. And I think the matter of urgency came from the fact that most of the people were ghosts in the kind of the government system. So at the beginning, they couldn't measure at the full kind of level. The way I see it, they considered them a different level of people. And I think the matter of urgency didn't come from the fact that they actually didn't see these people. These people were the ghosts of the system.
Yeah, I mean, we say, like, the problem with this, the problem with that. The problem all along was capitalism. I think you have to be in denial to take a view of this kind of history and not see the parallels there with this is how states function. This is how the market operates independently of this. It's more so in America, but also, let's face it, the NHS was rubbish on this here. Health was seen as an individual responsibility. Therefore, that's why it was kind of an individual failing if you got ill. And combine that with homosexuality even more. It was a sin, as it were. And in the kind of the intersection of society of who this affected, yeah, this was just capitalism working as capitalism does. It was looking to other populations, and there's always an enemy, there's always a victim, whether it's the immigrant, the ill, or the gays. And they picked on it. And markets worked exactly as they needed to. And yeah, it's just this was nothing out of the ordinary in terms of a capitalist analysis of history, because this is how capitalism operates. This is it at its ugliest, its dirtiest.
No, so I think you guys all kind of touched on it. That's one other thing that I wanted to look at is the impact that it had, because that's also something that we don't talk about. There's a lot of science and politics involved when we're talking about this pandemic, but the impacts that it had were not just in terms of lives lost. There were political impacts, of course, there were social impacts, economic impacts, of course, human impacts, because we lost so many people, which leads then to, for years, queer children who now might be adults, children, teens, having no one to relate to, because so many of the people that they could have looked up to and could have related to kind of disappeared. And we see it today where people are like, oh my God, it seems that everyone is queer today. So many people are coming out. What the hell? The gays have taken over. And it's kind of like, well, no, they haven't. They've always been here. But one, you either let them die, or two, they didn't feel comfortable enough to come out. Like, as we said, you don't just become queer. It just, in this society especially, it will be so hard for you to even to consider being accepted. And in the 80s, it would have been it, and it continues today. And then when so many of these voices are silenced and then literally taken because they're dead, of course, then you're going to have less people that are queer. It doesn't mean they don't exist. It doesn't mean they were never there. It means you either silence them or you killed them.
Period. And this links nicely with it. So you were mentioning or asking about the impacts, and then you also mentioned about all the people that we lost due to the, a whole generation of baby boomers, I guess. But this might be controversial, but I also count like any death that might be related, or hate crime that might be related to sort of homosexuality or to gay people. I count that as an impact of what the media did, of how the governments treated everything, because that just set the tone, didn't it? That set the tone to incentivize, I guess, anybody who wanted to perhaps, hate crime someone, I guess, like that it wasn't going to be taken seriously. And I think that motivated perhaps quite a lot of to go and, commit a hate crime and not maybe feel as nervous for the repercussions. So I think that's an impact, because it was just more than just it was a disease scientifically, and it was all of that was one side, but then what other cultural implications of it. And I think that the AIDS, so I don't know if you guys have watched Pose. Any of you Pose? Yeah. No? Well, it does touch on AIDS, and it also touches upon the transgender suffering of the 1980s. And I think they're very much linked. I think they're very, very much linked. So yeah, I look at it through a holistic lens, I guess. And that is one implication. Not only did we lose lives to the physical, disease, but then we also lost lives as a result of the stigma around it.
Also, to jump in, I think another impact was not just the lives that we lost, people that now would be in their 50s or 60s. I think that what the biggest impact was the grief that was left behind, purely because those people that lost their lives back in the 80s because of the AIDS pandemic, they were in their 20s, and I can just imagine the grief that their families felt. Parents who were not in their 50s burying their children, just seeing so much talent and so much potential go to waste. It's just, for me, it's the biggest impact the AIDS pandemic had.
I think when we look at the impact as well, it's kind of, I know in America it kind of inspired a lot of queer activism and kind of the ACT UP movement, and a lot of direct action was being carried out on the streets to push again, because this is kind of very shortly after the civil rights era movement, and kind of homosexuality is still like against state constitutions and laws and kind of stuff like that, and they're still fighting to repeal these. And actually it did force the American political system to adapt slightly, and it still took decades and decades for even the most basic things such as federal funding of needle exchange programs. But there was an advancement there. But in the UK as well, and America, there was kind of a better recognition of lesbians within the LGBT plus community, which I feel like isn't touched on enough when we talk about the AIDS pandemic, and how when there were doctors and nurses refusing to even go into the same hospital rooms as patients who tested positive because of the kind of the misinformation about how AIDS transmitted, there were kind of, I think they were called like the blood sisters, like groups of lesbians who would go in and would care for mostly gay men until they died, essentially bedside assistance. And it was kind of in that period which I think we saw an advancement of equality in social respect, because I think there was, and there still is a lot of lesbophobia, I can't remember the exact term for it, within the community, but actually there was kind of a recognition of how we're all in this together and we've got to look out for each other. And I think that has extended. And I could be wrong on this, but I believe it actually switched the order of the letters in LGBT, because I think it used to be the G first, but then the L was kind of swapped to kind of honour the contribution of lesbians during the pandemic. There has been a change in how, as a queer community, we identify with each other. And I think a lot of that has been lost again now in history. But there have been advancements, and obviously there's the political legacies, kind of free condoms, although people don't know what it's about now. They think it's just about solving pregnancy or a frivolous thing. But yeah, this is a direct result of AIDS.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, when we looked at the impacts, there's really layers to it. You kind of see the first thing, it's of course the number of deaths. That's, as you said, KJ, direct or indirect deaths. There's psychological impacts. That's the thing. There are a lot of queer and non-queer survivors that talk about it. People are testifying, and it's cases of PTSD, and people are mourning. They lost loved ones, they lost partners, they almost lost their own lives. They look back on it as an actual tragedy, and I think we really underestimate the psychological impacts that it would have had on them and then future generations as well. Because we talk about it a lot, for example, for the Black Lives Matter movement. It is something that we can very much apply here. Generational trauma, it is something that will follow people through generations. When you look at that, you look at the social impacts. Back then, you had people that had no choice but to come out to their families because they came back positive for HIV. People who were being disowned and abandoned by all of their loved ones. You had, people who were left without friends, without family, without any form of support, without any money in the countries that you need money to access healthcare. And then on top of all of that, you've got, no emotional support. You've got people who are still alive that are having to be activists, supporters, try and either treat themselves or treat their loved ones, sometimes do both. You get so many testimonies from people who are saying, well, yeah, my partner was HIV positive, but it was a much more advanced case of it. So in the morning, I'd be in the hospital with him, and then I'd have to go and get my test done. And then I'd have to go and be in the streets to be an activist. And then I'd have to go and help set up this charity. And then I had to write this press release or this and this thing to try and educate people on it. And then I had to go to a funeral. People forget that weekly people had to go to more and more funerals, because what people forget with marginalized communities, we all know each other. It comes to a point where we either all know each other or we know someone that knows someone that knows someone. It's always going to be like that, because it is within those communities that you find refuge and that you find support and understanding. So all of this socially, psychologically would have been horrible, because these are people that weren't necessarily ready to come out. It wasn't necessarily safe for them to come out, who were at risk because they didn't know how to have safe sex. It was people that were targeted by the media, by governments, by everyone. They had no support anywhere. So the impacts were going to be coming left, right, and center at them.
Yeah, like what you said about how in marginalized communities, we all know each other. In the US, they tried to shut the kind of gay bathhouses and kind of queer locations. They were already shutting themselves because everybody was dying. People weren't coming in. But at the start, kind of the gay clubs were the people raising money for all their patrons who had kind of started to get ill. And I think what you talked about with generational trauma and stuff, I am someone who no one I know, to my knowledge, has HIV.